When most people think of the Caribbean, they picture beaches, music, and endless sunshine. But behind the paradise postcard, there's a serious story unfolding in the skies above. One of the region's most important air connections, the Jamaica to Fort Lauderdale route, is losing a major player. Starting November 2nd, 2025, Caribbean Airlines, the flag carrier of Trinidad and Tobago, will stop flying between Kingston, Montego Bay, and South Florida. At first glance, this may seem like a minor announcement. Airlines cancel routes all the time. But look a little deeper, and this decision speaks volumes about the struggles of regional aviation, the dominance of U.S. giants, and the fragile balance between cultural identity and cold economics. This is more than a flight cancellation. It's a story about how Caribbean Airlines fought to reclaim its place in the market, only to be overwhelmed by realities beyond its control. It's a story that affects diaspora families, tourism economies, and the very idea of whether small airlines can survive in today's world. So let's rewind, dive deep, and understand what's really happening here. To understand the significance of this retreat, we need to go back to December 2024. That's when Caribbean Airlines proudly reintroduced its flights from Jamaica to Fort Lauderdale after a 5-year absence. For many, it felt like a victory, not just for the airline, but for the Caribbean community as a whole. The Montego Bay-Fort Lauderdale connection was more than just a tourism pipeline. Montego Bay, known as Mo Bay to locals, is Jamaica's tourism capital, the beating heart of resorts, cruise arrivals, and international visitors. In Fort Lauderdale, that airport is practically an extension of the Caribbean itself. Tens of thousands of Jamaicans, Haitians, Trinidadians, and Bahamians live in South Florida. When you land in Fort Lauderdale, it doesn't feel like you're entering a foreign country. It feels like you've stepped into another branch of the Caribbean family. That's why this relaunch mattered. It wasn't only about tourists heading to all-inclusive resorts. It was about families reuniting, diaspora ties being maintained, and a sense of cultural pride being restored. For many Jamaicans in South Florida, seeing Caribbean Airlines back on the departures board felt like home was finally back in the skies. Caribbean Airlines itself seemed confident. They didn't return cautiously. They went big. By March 2025, they expanded Montego Bay flights to daily service, a bold statement in an already competitive market. And Kingston, Jamaica's bustling capital, also regained its Fort Lauderdale link, a route that had been suspended since 2019. The timing seemed perfect. Travel demand was rebounding after the pandemic. Tourism in Jamaica was hitting record highs. Diaspora travel was booming. Local travel agents reported a wave of bookings. Tourism leaders hailed the return as a boost for connectivity. For a moment, Caribbean Airlines looked like it had struck gold. But the aviation industry has a way of humbling even the most optimistic. Here's where the story takes a sharp turn. By May 2025, just 5 months after the relaunch, reports surfaced that the Kingston-Fort Lauderdale flights were operating with load factors as low as 32%. Now, let's pause here. In airline economics, load factor, the percentage of seats filled with paying passengers, is everything. Most airlines need at least 70 to 80% to break even. Anything less, and you're burning cash. Picture it, a 150-seat aircraft. To be healthy, you'd want at least 110 or 120 of those seats filled. But on Caribbean Airlines Kingston flights, barely 50 passengers were boarding. That meant 2/3 of the plane was empty. Every flight was essentially a money-losing venture. And it wasn't just Kingston. The Montego Bay route also struggled. Despite being marketed as a critical tourism link, competition in the Fort Lauderdale market was so intense that Caribbean Airlines simply couldn't gain enough traction. For an airline already balancing on a financial tightrope, these numbers weren't just disappointing. They were catastrophic. The obvious question is, why? With such strong cultural and economic ties between Jamaica and Florida, why couldn't Caribbean Airlines make it work? There are 4 big answers. First, competition. The Jamaica-Fort Lauderdale corridor is one of the most saturated in the region. Spirit Airlines dominates with ultra-low fares. JetBlue is beloved as the unofficial Caribbean airline, offering more routes and loyalty perks than anyone else. American Airlines, through nearby Miami, has unmatched connectivity to the rest of the U.S. and beyond. Caribbean Airlines walked into a battlefield with three giants who already controlled customer loyalty, schedules, and pricing power. Second, passenger loyalty. Diaspora travelers may love the idea of a Caribbean-owned airline, but most have long since built habits with the established carriers. JetBlue offers a familiar product and attractive frequent flyer rewards. Spirit lures cost-sensitive travelers with its rock-bottom pricing. American offers seamless connections for travelers who need more than just a non-stop flight. Caribbean Airlines, with limited brand recognition in the U.S., struggled to convince passengers to switch. Third, costs. Operating in today's aviation world is brutally expensive. Jet fuel prices are volatile. Aircraft leasing is costly. Maintenance and labor expenses are rising. Large airlines can absorb these costs through sheer scale. Smaller airlines like Caribbean Airlines feel the pinch much harder. Running half-empty flights in such an environment is financial suicide. And fourth, identity. Caribbean Airlines holds immense cultural value in the region. People feel proud seeing their own airline represent them in the skies. But in Fort Lauderdale, cultural pride couldn't overcome the raw realities of price, convenience, and competition. A handful of loyal passengers might have enjoyed the Caribbean meals, the music, and the accents of the crew. But the majority made decisions based on ticket price and schedule, and Caribbean Airlines simply couldn't compete on those terms. This isn't just about Fort Lauderdale. Caribbean Airlines has been battling financial instability for years. The airline was created in 2006 after the collapse of BWI, West Indies Airways. It inherited a proud legacy, but also deep structural challenges. Throughout the 2010s, Caribbean Airlines posted regular losses. Government subsidies from Trinidad and Tobago kept it alive, but profitability remained elusive. By the mid-2010s, it became clear that the airline was struggling to find a sustainable business model. Then came the pandemic. Like airlines worldwide, Caribbean Airlines grounded much of its fleet in 2020. Passenger revenue collapsed. Cargo operations kept a small lifeline going, but losses mounted. By 2021, the airline had to restructure, laying off staff, cutting routes, and downsizing to survive. The Trinidad and Tobago government, tired of endless bailouts, began pressuring the airline to prove its commercial viability. No more operating routes, just for sentiment or national pride. Every flight had to justify itself financially. In that context, the Jamaica, Fort Lauderdale experiment was risky from start. It was a bold attempt to reclaim market share, but one that quickly exposed how vulnerable the airline remained. By late summer 2025, the verdict was clear. Caribbean Airlines officially announced it would suspend both Kingston, Fort Lauderdale, and Montego Bay, Fort Lauderdale routes effective November 2nd. For Caribbean Airlines, it was about survival. For passengers, especially the diaspora, it felt like a cultural loss. Some might shrug this off as a minor route change. But in the Caribbean, airline connectivity is everything. When you live on island, air routes aren't luxuries, they're lifelines. They connect families, power tourism, and sustain economies. That's why Caribbean Airlines exit stings. It reduces choice for travelers. It disrupts family connections. And it exposes the fragility of regional aviation in a world dominated by giant carriers. But also highlights a tough truth. Survival sometimes requires sacrifice. Caribbean Airlines had to choose between keeping pride alive on an unprofitable route or cutting its losses to preserve the airline's future. It chose survival. For most global travelers, a canceled airline route is little more than an inconvenience. You open a booking site, you find another carrier, and your plans adjust. But in the Caribbean, things work differently. Routes are not just commercial connections, they're cultural lifelines. For the Jamaican diaspora in South Florida, the loss of Caribbean Airlines flights hits especially hard. South Florida is home to one of the largest Jamaican communities outside of Jamaica itself, with estimates ranging from 300,000 to 400,000 people of Jamaican descent. Fort Lauderdale is their hub, their gateway, their main link to Kingston and Montego Bay. When Caribbean Airlines relaunched service in December 2024, many in the diaspora celebrated. They weren't just buying a ticket, they were buying familiarity. The accents of flight attendants reminded them of home. The Caribbean meals on board felt like a taste of culture in the sky. For older generations especially, Caribbean Airlines wasn't just another airline. It was a piece of identity. So when news broke in late 2025 that the routes would again be canceled, disappointment spread quickly. For diaspora families planning Christmas reunions, for students flying back and forth for college, for grandparents who relied on the cultural comfort of their airline, this was more than a schedule change. It was a reminder of how fragile Caribbean-owned connectivity really is. Yes, JetBlue, Spirit, and American Airlines still fly the routes. In fact, their schedules are extensive. But for many, flying on those airlines feels like stepping into someone else's system. The warmth of the Caribbean brand is lost. And while practicality usually wins, a ticket is a ticket. After all, the emotional void is undeniable. For Jamaica's tourism sector, the retreat raises big questions. Montego Bay is not just Jamaica's tourism hub. It's one of the most important tourism cities in the entire Caribbean. Each year, millions of visitors arrive through its Sangster International Airport, heading to resorts, villas, and adventure spots across the island. Fort Lauderdale has long been a gateway for these visitors, especially for family travelers, Jamaican Americans bringing relatives to visit, and cultural tourists seeking a homecoming experience. Losing Caribbean Airlines' presence doesn't mean the flow will stop, but it does shrink the options. Fewer airlines on a route often means less competition, and less competition usually means higher fares. Tourism officials worry that reduced seat capacity could impact Jamaica's ability to maintain its impressive visitor growth. The island has been on a tourism winning streak, breaking records for arrivals year after year. But sustaining that growth depends heavily on stable and affordable airlift. Every lost route is a risk to the momentum. Montego Bay, in particular, could feel the impact. This isn't New York or London, where multiple carriers and airports guarantee redundancy. Fort Lauderdale is unique in its Caribbean-heavy passenger base. Caribbean Airlines leaving reduces diversity in the marketplace, leaving the field dominated by the big U.S. players. The big question many are asking, is this goodbye forever or just goodbye for now? Caribbean Airlines executives have been careful in their language. They didn't slam the door shut completely. Instead, they spoke of network optimization, aviation's polite term for cutting routes that don't work and reallocating resources elsewhere. The message is clear: never say never, but don't expect a quick comeback. For a return to happen, several conditions would need to change. One possibility is reduced competition. If, for example, one of the U.S. carriers were to scale back service, Caribbean Airlines might see an opening. But given that JetBlue, Spirit, and American are deeply entrenched in South Florida, this seems unlikely in the near future. Another path could be partnerships. Caribbean Airlines might consider a code share or interline agreement with a U.S. carrier, allowing them to feed passengers onto each other's networks. Such partnerships can reduce risk while keeping a presence in the market. But forging these agreements is complex and requires leverage Caribbean Airlines may not have. Finally, improved demand could shift the equation. If Jamaica's tourism sector grows even faster, or if diaspora travel surges in a way that overwhelms existing carriers, there may be room for Caribbean Airlines to re-enter. But as of now, the economics simply don't justify it. Caribbean Airlines' retreat is not an isolated story. Across the globe, small and regional airlines are facing the same dilemma. Compete head-to-head with giants or retreat to niches where they can survive. Consider LIT, once the bus in the sky for the Eastern Caribbean. After years of financial struggle, it collapsed in 2020, leaving a gaping hole in regional connectivity. Or look at Air Jamaica, a beloved national airline that ultimately folded in 2010 after years of heavy losses its operations absorbed by Caribbean Airlines itself. These examples show the brutal reality. Cultural pride cannot shield airlines from economics. Operating an airline requires scale, efficiency, and resources that many small carriers simply don't have. Caribbean Airlines' decision to withdraw from Fort Lauderdale is painful, but it may also be wise. Spreading too thin in hostile markets risks dragging down the entire airline. Concentrating on profitable routes, especially within the Caribbean itself, where competitors are fewer and cultural loyalty stronger, might be the only way to ensure survival. Whenever a Caribbean airline struggles, the old question resurfaces. Why don't Caribbean nations pool resources and build one strong, unified airline? It's an idea that's been floated for decades. Proponents argue that instead of each island funding its own loss-making carrier, the region could unite behind a single airline, leveraging economies of scale, shared fleets, and stronger bargaining power. Such an airline could compete more effectively with global giants, while still preserving the cultural identity passengers value. But the politics of the Caribbean make this difficult. National pride, competing interests, and financial disagreements have doomed past attempts. Each island wants its flag on the tail, its hub prioritized, its citizens employed. In practice, unity has always been elusive. Still, moments like this, Caribbean Airlines leaving Fort Lauderdale, LIT collapsing, Air Jamaica gone, highlight just how urgent the need has become. Without deeper cooperation, regional aviation will remain fragmented and fragile, vulnerable to the decisions of much larger players. There's another layer to this story: tourism dependence. Jamaica, like many Caribbean nations, relies heavily on tourism for economic survival. The industry accounts for more than 30% of Jamaica's GDP and provides jobs for hundreds of thousands. But tourism is only as strong as the airlift that supports it. If airlines cut routes, if fares rise, if connectivity weakens, tourism suffers. And with it, the entire economy feels the pain. This overdependence on tourism makes Jamaica and its neighbors vulnerable not only to airline decisions, but also to global shocks. We saw this during the pandemic when closed borders brought tourism to a standstill. We're seeing it again now, as small shifts in airline strategy ripple through entire economies. The lesson here is clear. Caribbean nations must diversify. Tourism will always be important, but investing in other sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, digital services, reduces vulnerability to the whims of airlines and the volatility of global travel demand. It's important to place this in the wider aviation context. Airlines worldwide are consolidating. Mega carriers like Delta, United, and American dominate long-haul travel. Low-cost carriers like Spirit and Ryanair squeeze margins on short-haul routes. In between, regional airlines are being squeezed out. Caribbean Airlines is not alone in facing this pressure. Around the world, small national carriers are struggling to justify their existence. Many survive only because governments subsidize them, viewing them as essential infrastructure rather than profitable businesses. But governments are also strapped for cash. Trinidad and Tobago has made it clear it cannot endlessly fund Caribbean Airlines without results. Jamaica, for its part, has resisted relaunching its own national carrier after Air Jamaica's collapse, wary of the costs. The region is learning, painfully, that sentiment alone cannot keep an airline in the skies. So where does this leave Caribbean Airlines? In the short term, the strategy is clear. Focus on markets where it can build an advantage. That means intra-Caribbean routes, where big U.S. carriers have little interest. It also means high-yield long-haul flights where niche demand exists. Every plane must be deployed where it can generate the most return. For Jamaica, the takeaway is also sobering. Relying on outside airlines is inevitable but dangerous. Ensuring diversified connectivity, courting multiple carriers, encouraging competition, even exploring joint ventures, will be critical to safeguard tourism and diaspora connections. And for the diaspora, the message is bittersweet. Caribbean Airlines' retreat may feel like a betrayal, but it reflects the harsh truth of modern aviation. Loyalty is treasured, but in the end, survival trumps sentiment. Caribbean Airlines' withdrawal from the Jamaica, Fort Lauderdale market is not just a business decision. It's a symbol of the struggles regional airlines face in a globalized, hyper-competitive industry. For passengers, it means fewer choices and the loss of a culturally familiar brand. For Jamaica's tourism and diaspora, it's a reminder of how fragile connectivity really is. And for Caribbean Airlines, it's a survival strategy, cutting losses today in the hope of staying alive tomorrow. Whether the airline ever returns to Fort Lauderdale remains uncertain. But one thing is crystal clear. In today's aviation world, only the strongest and smartest survive. Caribbean Airlines has made its choice. Now the region must adapt. If you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll keep exploring the untold stories shaping the Caribbean and the wider world. Stories that connect culture, economics, and identity in ways that few others cover.